when I was invited to join a group of staffers and on the second floor in the residence of the White House. And President Kennedy took me on a tour of the rooms of the White House, and it ended up in a bedroom.
Have you ever wondered what life behind the White House doors really looked like for one of America's most famous presidents? John F. Kennedy is remembered for his charm, charisma, and the political energy he brought to the Oval Office.
I can, at this time, emphatically state that my relationship with Jack Kennedy was of a close personal nature.
But what about the private side of his life? The side that didn't make the headlines? Reports, memoirs, and interviews have painted a picture of a president whose personal relationships were far more complicated than the public ever saw.
She was one of the very most beautiful women when she was in her early 20s. I don't blame President Kennedy for, of course, he went after anything, but he did have some beautiful women.
Some of the women linked to him were famous stars, while others were young interns or social acquaintances. The stories involve secrecy, intrigue, and moments that could have shaken the presidency if they were ever revealed. From Hollywood icons to political insiders, the list is astonishing. Keep watching as we uncover every woman John F. Kennedy is reported to have had affairs with. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe's association with the Kennedys is one of the most enduring images in 20th century American pop culture. By 1962, she was an internationally known film star and celebrity. The public moment most often cited is Monroe's sultry performance of Happy Birthday, Mr. President at Madison Square Garden on May 19, 1962. A Democratic fundraiser and birthday salute for JFK.
Happy birthday to you.
The single public performance, in a figure-hugging dress and with a breathy vocal delivery, created an image that has been replayed widely and fed much of the later rumor and fascination. Primary sources, photographic records, and contemporaneous press coverage confirm her high-profile presence at that event. Beyond that public moment, biographies and investigative accounts disagree over how sustained any private sexual relationship between Monroe and Kennedy may have been. Several biographers and people in Monroe's circle reported private contacts between her and men close to the president. Some accounts assert at least one intimate meeting in March 1962, while other historians stress the limits of documentary proof. In short, there is evidence Monroe moved within the Kennedys' wider orbit, and there are credible reports of private encounters, but the detailed pattern of a prolonged affair has not been established with the same documentary certainty as, for example, the first-hand memoirs of White House interns. Monroe herself told friends and confidants about sexual involvement with powerful men on occasion. Those statements, made when she was alive, add to the sense that she did have private links to influential circles. After her death in August 1962, speculation intensified, partly because her death was sudden and controversial. Her death produced a spate of conspiracy theories that tied her to an array of powerful figures. Mainstream historians treat many of those conspiracy claims cautiously, noting that sensational accounts often outpaced verifiable evidence. Still, scholars and reporters accept that Monroe's public interaction with the Kennedy circle was real and that the event at Madison Square Garden amplified public perception of a private link. A key reason Monroe's name remains central to the Kennedy story is the combination of public spectacle, unresolved elements after her death, and the celebrity politics overlap in the early 1960s. Even small, well-documented episodes, the birthday song and the photograph of Monroe wearing that dress, have outsized cultural weight. Any careful account must separate: 1. The documented public performance and her known contacts with Kennedy's circle. 2. First-hand claims about private meetings. And 3. Later speculation or conspiracy that lacks corroboration. On that cautious map, Monroe remains a highly visible figure, with confirmed public ties to the Kennedy orbit and plausible private contact. But the strongest sensational theories about cover-ups are not supported by clear public records. Judith Exner. Judith Campbell. Exner's name links three recurring themes in the JFK story: Hollywood and show business networks, Chicago organized crime, and claims about private channels connecting underworld figures to the political elite. Exner first attracted attention in the public record because she moved in entertainment circles and later claimed relationships with both John F. Kennedy and with Sam Giancana, a Chicago mob figure. In interviews, a memoir, and public testimony, she offered a detailed narrative. She said she knew Kennedy, had an on-and-off affair that extended into his presidency, and at one point said she had acted as an intermediary between Kennedy and Giancana. Those claims, when published, caused intense press interest because they suggested a personal route by which mob influence might have reached political decision-making. Exner's public statements evolved across decades. She first told parts of her story in the 1970s and later expanded claims in interviews and a 1990 Vanity Fair profile. In some instances, contemporaneous records or other witnesses provided partial corroboration. For example, references in government files and investigative reporting that document contact between organized crime figures and people in Kennedy's orbit. At the same time, parts of Exner's narrative remain disputed and contested by scholars and some contemporaries. That uneven evidence record is important. It makes Exner central to debate, but it also leaves open many questions about what precisely she saw, what she carried or arranged, and how direct the lines of influence actually were. A few concrete claims have been particularly consequential. Exner at times said she arranged meetings between Kennedy and Giancana during the 1960 campaign that helped secure Illinois votes. She later told interviewers she had acted as a courier for packages between Kennedy and Giancana. Investigative reporters and subsequent historians have examined those claims closely. Researchers found some circumstantial support for connections tying prominent entertainment figures, Sinatra, for example, to mob contacts and to the Kennedys' political machinery. But the record rarely offers full documentary proof that would satisfy a modern court of history on every point Exner raised. One reason Exner's story matters beyond the lurid headlines is that it exposes how personal relationships could form part of political coalitions in mid-century America. Networks that combined campaign advice, celebrity reach, and, sometimes, criminal influence. The overlap between entertainment, local political machines, and national campaigns was real. The judgment historians are left to make is how direct and decisive those overlaps were in Kennedy's rise and governance. Exner's testimony remains an important, contested source. Scholars treat portions as credible and other portions as uncertain, which is why her name continues to attract attention in books, documentaries, and primary source releases. Mimi Alford. Mimi Alford's account is distinctive because she went on the record with a full memoir describing her time as a White House intern and her 18-month relationship with President Kennedy. Alford's book, Once Upon a Secret, and interviews around the memoir provide detailed, first-person descriptions of how a young intern, 19 when she arrived in Washington in the summer of 1962, became involved with the president and how those encounters fit into White House travel and personal rhythms. Because she wrote a memoir and gave on-the-record interviews, historians can treat her narrative as a primary source in a way that is not possible for many rumors and third-party claims. Alford describes a pattern of private liaisons during presidential travel and in the White House itself, sometimes arranged through members of the inner circle. Her narrative includes moments of confusion, attraction, and later regret. and she reflects on how the power imbalance shaped her experience. Readers of her memoir find passages that detail where encounters happened, who was involved in arranging privacy, and the emotional consequences. Because she is a named, living, when the memoir was published, participant, her account carries a different evidentiary weight than anonymous gossip. That does not mean every detail is beyond debate. Memory fades, and close recollections written decades later require cautious reading. But Alford's account is treated by scholars and journalists as credible primary material for understanding the social life within the executive mansion in that era. Her testimony also raised ethical and political questions about power dynamics. For modern readers, the idea of a president having a sexual relationship with a very young intern feels different than mid-century norms. Alford herself reflects on the asymmetry. A young intern in awe of power, and a president with the resources and staff to arrange secrecy. Her narrative also shows how secrecy and deference in the White House allowed certain relationships to go unreported for decades. When Alford's book appeared, the public re-examination of such events sparked debate about consent, office ethics, and the ways institutions shield personal conduct. Because Alford's account is a full memoir, scholars often reference it when discussing the interior culture of the Kennedy White House. Historians treat it alongside other private sources to build a fuller picture, while also noting the need to weigh memory against contemporaneous records. On balance, Alford's memoir is one of the clearest single documents describing a private White House relationship and the emotional aftermath for someone who later chose to place the experience on the public record. Mary Panchote Meyer. Mary Panchote Meyer occupies a different place in the Kennedy story because her life mixes a documented private relationship, tragic death, and lingering mystery. Meyer was a well-connected Washington artist and hostess who, after her divorce, developed close ties to influential Washington circles. Several respected contemporaries and later memoirs indicate a private relationship between Meyer and Kennedy in the early 1960s. The relationship is treated as credible in much of the literature because of contemporaneous testimony from friends and family. The element that has kept Meyer in the public eye is her murder. On October 12, 1964, Meyer was shot to death on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath in Georgetown. A man was arrested and tried for the killing but was later acquitted. The case left many unanswered questions. Complicating the story was the claim that Meyer kept a private diary containing material about her life, and some witnesses later said the diary was removed and destroyed in the days after her death, an action that has fueled speculation ever since. That sequence, private relationship, sudden violent death, destruction of potentially revealing papers, naturally prompts questions. Historians and journalists have treated the case with both careful reporting and cautious skepticism about conspiracy narratives. Writers who have investigated Meyer's life point to credible testimony indicating she and Kennedy met repeatedly from January 1962 until his death in 1963. Others, including journalists, family members, and some friends, have offered different interpretations about what Meyer may have known or written down. Some later accounts propose she may have known sensitive information or possessed notes that could have had national security implications. Those theories reach into the realm of speculation because primary documentary evidence, the alleged diary itself, is not publicly available. The lack of that key document is why Meyer's case has a persistent, open question quality. We have strong testimony about an intimate relationship and a violent death. We lack the material artifact that could settle many claims. The Meyer story shows how an otherwise private liaison can gain sustained public attention when followed by a violent or unexplained death. Historians treat her life and death as a mix of confirmed events, the relationship, the murder, plausible secondary claims, the diary's removal, and contested interpretations. Because the murder trial did not yield a definitive legal resolution, and because important documentary evidence is missing from the public record, Meyer's name remains one of the more fraught and discussed items in the larger Kennedy narrative. Gunilla von Post. Gunilla von Post's account is among the better documented memoirs that describe a youthful and romantic connection with John F. Kennedy in the 1950s, before his presidency. Von Post published Love, Jack, a memoir that includes letters and recollections of a relationship that began in 1953 and continued in correspondence and occasional meetings through the later 1950s. Because she published letters and personal documents, historians have concrete material to examine. Von Post's writing gives a direct window into a pre-presidential relationship and is treated as an important primary source in studies of Kennedy's life before the White House. Von Post's memoir portrays Kennedy as a man torn between private affections and political ambition. The correspondence she published shows a tone and intimacy that support the claim of a serious early romance. That matters for two reasons. First, it places at least some of Kennedy's private life before he assumed the intense scrutiny of a presidential campaign. Second, it shows how letters and private memorabilia can provide a stable documentary foundation for personal claims that are otherwise lost to rumor. Von Post's materials therefore rank among the better documented personal sources for JFK's pre-presidential relationships. Readers and researchers also weigh Von Post's account against other contemporaneous evidence. Because the relationship occurred before the national spotlight fully fell on Kennedy, the correspondence and memoir form the bulk of the documentary base. As with most memoirs, readers must still consider motive, memory, and the selection of letters included in a published volume. But the presence of physical letters and a sustained narrative gives Von Post's account stronger documentary footing than many later, second-hand allegations. For those studying how Kennedy balanced private emotion and political calculation, Von Post's memoir offers clear evidence of an early and serious romance that Kennedy ultimately chose not to convert into marriage because of his career. Inga Arvad. Inga Arvad was a Danish journalist and former Miss Denmark who met a young John F. Kennedy before he became a national figure. The relationship took place in the late 1930s and early 1940s while Kennedy served in the Navy, and Arvad worked as a foreign correspondent. Arvad's earlier career included high-profile interviews, notably a 1936 interview with Adolf Hitler, and that background drew FBI scrutiny during wartime because of concern about contacts between foreign journalists and Axis officials. Those official suspicions led FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to watch Arvad's contacts, and when the young naval officer John Kennedy became involved with her, his father reportedly intervened out of political concern. Arvad has long been cited as one of the strongest examples of how national security worries intersected with personal relationships. Accounts indicate Joseph P. Kennedy grew alarmed at the possible political damage that public knowledge of the relationship might cause. The family's response, quickly ending the connection between Jack, as JFK was then known, and Arvad, shows how private romances could have direct political consequences when a family sought higher office. The FBI's files and later histories document that Arvad was investigated for possible intelligence links. Historians now generally conclude the evidence of espionage is weak, but the wartime atmosphere made any contact with controversial European figures politically sensitive. Kennedy's father apparently calculated the risk was too high for his son's future prospects. Arvad's story is useful because it highlights a pattern repeated across other episodes: personal relationships that existed before serious public scrutiny, later viewed in new light as security concerns or political liabilities. For the young Kennedy, the Arvad episode was an early lesson in how private life could shape political opportunity. While modern readers may focus on the FBI's wartime paranoia, the core facts are straightforward. A brief, intense romance, FBI interest because of Arvad's contacts, and family intervention to end the relationship before it could damage a future political career. Gene Tierney. Gene Tierney was an established Hollywood star known for roles such as the lead in Laura, 1944. Accounts place a romance between Tierney and a young John F. Kennedy in the late 1940s, before his marriage to Jacqueline Bouvier and before his national political rise. The relationship, by most accounts, was serious enough that Tierney expected commitment, and later memoirs and interviews suggest Kennedy ended it in part because he felt political life would not allow him to marry an actress. The episode is cited often as part of a string of pre-presidential romances. Tierney's personal history also underscores the human costs of public life. She experienced a well-documented family and health tragedy, a rubella infection during pregnancy whose effects deeply affected her daughter's health, and that personal context shaped much of her later life. The Tierney-Kennedy link is therefore read in biographies both as a youthful romance and as a moment when Kennedy chose ambition over marriage. That choice would recur. The pattern of private relationships that did not translate into public commitment is a repeated theme in Kennedy's early life. Most historical work treats the Tierney episode as credible, but not especially consequential to policy or public events. It matters mainly as part of the texture of Kennedy's private life. The relationship did not carry the later national security or scandal implications of other names on the list. Instead, Tierney's story helps explain Kennedy's personal trajectory. A man who kept private ties to well-known women while focusing on a political career that required compromises in his personal life. Biographers use the episode to underline that trade-off. If you found this video fascinating, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more intriguing stories from history. Hit the bell so you never miss an update, and let us know in the comments which story surprised you the most. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.